Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today on this Facebook Live. My name is Peniel, and I'm the Policy Engagement Coordinator of AFSC's Policy Office. If you're wondering where you are, you're joining us for our Facebook Live MIDI. Normally, we have mini-sized ones, which are about 30 minutes. Today, we have a special edition, which will be a bit longer. And we'll be talking about lessons from COVID-19, what it means to build back better for our communities. Please let us know where you're joining us from in the chat. Just say hi so that we know that you're here, and we'll go ahead and get started shortly. All right, you can go ahead and just put that in there. And I'm going to introduce myself again, and then I'm going to call on our different panelists. I'll introduce them briefly, and then I'll just turn to them to say a little bit more of their full role. So once again, I am Peniel. I'm the American Policy Engagement Coordinator of AFSC, and I'm going to facilitate this great conversation with my colleagues here today. I'm joined today by Banan Abdelrahman, who's a campaign coordinator at AFSC's New Jersey Immigrant Rights Program. Banan, do you want to say a quick hi?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today.
Thanks, Banan. And also joined by John Lindsay-Poland, the co-director of AFSC's California Healing Justice Program. John, a little shout out to the people.
Hey everybody.
Thanks, John. We're also joined by Sayrah Namaste, the director of AFSC's New Mexico Area Program. Hi, Sayrah.
Hola, buenas tardes from New Mexico.
Thanks, Sayrah. And last but not least, we're joined by Rick Wilson, the program director of AFSC's West Virginia Economic Justice Program. Hi, Rick.
Hi, thanks for being here, and disregard the rooster in the background, please.
Will do. So today I'm joined by my colleagues to reflect on how the pandemic has changed our work and which lessons from the past year and a half will continue to shape our approaches to addressing the injustices and inequalities that the pandemic really threw more light on in our communities. So I have some questions prepared for our panelists. We'll hear from them for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up to some dialogue in the event that you have any questions you would like to ask them. Based on what they have shared or other pieces as well. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get us started. So as you all know, the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted communities worldwide while exposing sort of standing structural inequalities and ongoing injustices across the systems that we live in. It was shining a spotlight on an even distribution of relief as well as burdens that people bore in our infrastructure, in our economy, in our communities. It also showed the uneven distribution of resources and opportunities and goods and and other kinds of items that we find in our economy, in our communities today. The inequality and the injustice challenges also arose from the policy reactions to the pandemic. And so we saw how some of our governments responded to the pandemic by in ways that did not honor the God-given dignity as a Quaker-based organization will call for. AFSC has a program called Under the Mask, which talks about across the U.S. In some spaces as well as across the world, how governments were responding to the pandemic that really infringed on human rights and civil rights of individuals. And so we saw that in the knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic, the policy reactions were also uneven, and many were excluded from the relief that was supposed to come from that. Beginning in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, AFSC staff, AFSC volunteers, community partners, supporters, and more moved rapidly to organize initiatives and meet rising needs of our community members. You'll see in the chat a nice compilation of the ways that we came to care for each other during COVID-19 through some of your support, as well as through the support of other community partners. So today we're going to talk about, pre-COVID, what were we doing? During COVID, what did we have to do? And post-COVID, what would we like to continue doing? That is sort of the thread of the conversation we want to have today. So from my panelists, what I want to hear, just really briefly, before the pandemic started, what was the scope of your program and or project, whichever way you define it? And let's hear first from Banan. What was the scope of your work before the pandemic?
Hi, thank you, Peniel, for that. Well, I'm going to just focus on so the New Jersey office is multifaceted in terms of the work that they offer the community, but I will focus on the anti-detention work we've been doing. In terms of our anti-detention campaigns, we focused a lot on supporting local groups and building coalitions to end local detention contracts. And oppose renewals. And a lot of our energies were focused on that. And then from time to time, we also focus on created accountability and oversight at the county level, since a lot of our detention facilities are county contracts and served on commissions and committees that had oversight over conditions and pushed back against certain ICE actions.
Thanks, Banan. So interesting to hear that pre the pandemic, there was a lot of work, around anti-detention policy engagement, anti-detention campaign furthering, which obviously continued during the pandemic, but we'll come back to hear what that looked like during the pandemic. Rick, can you share briefly what your work looked like before the pandemic?
Yeah, glad to do that. Our main focus is on economic justice issues affecting low-income and working families. And probably the ones most relevant to this discussion have to do with food security, hunger, child nutrition, and child poverty. And there were certain things that we were grinding away at before, sometimes offensive, sometimes defensive. And the COVID thing illustrates something we use when we think about policy stream, is that when certain things come together, a window opens to affect policy change. And COVID's a perfect example of that. When it happened, things that were impossible became possible and vice versa.
Thanks, Rick. Important to hear that food security. I know during the pandemic, that industry was essential in ways that we finally came to see. And we also came to see who was essential within that industry and who bore the burdens of uplifting and holding that industry together, but who was also neglected from the relief for that kind of work. Sayrah, can you share briefly what the scope of your work was before the pandemic as well?
Yes, here in New Mexico, our program accompanies land-based people. These are indigenous and Indo-Hispano traditional people of the land. And one of the ways we do that is to support them around land and water issues. So we give a lot of support to small-scale farmers who are feeding their communities and using methods that do not drive climate change, and a lot about food access, making sure that the food that traditional people are growing are getting to the people who need it most. And so we have all kinds of programs in terms of training and technical support and infrastructure and markets, but with always that focus on accompanying the people to keep their culture, their land, and their water rights so that they can feed themselves.
Thanks, Sayrah. John, what was your program looking like all the way in California before the pandemic?
Well, thanks. The California Healing Justice Program has focused on decarceration and policing primarily, as well as restorative justice. And we work in coalition with groups that are led by people impacted by the carceral system. And most of our work is really focused on changing policies and budgets, which is done in coalition. And I would say, the context of the pandemic is at least as important as that has been the context of the racial justice uprising that also coincided with the first months of the pandemic after George Floyd was murdered.
Thanks, John. So, a range of work was going on, all of it dynamic and unique to the needs of their communities, but also work that is often needed across the country. Food security, insecurity is something that across the United States is a problem that folks are experiencing. There are detention centers in every state, almost in the United States. The carceral system is as expansive as it possibly could be, and many people are subjected to the horrors of that system. And so we know that during the pandemic, a lot of the individuals impacted by the systems that you're working to either dismantle or to strengthen faced, unrivaled challenges that you had already had before, but became even more profound during the pandemic. So, Banan, just to check in with you a little bit on this, as I was doing my research, in fiscal year 2020, according to what the government will call fiscal year 2020, which sort of pulled into the pandemic around till October, 21 people died in ICE custody. So that's Immigration, Customs and Enforcement's detention facilities, the highest death rate in 15 years. During a pandemic, we know that the risks in detention centers and similar carceral facilities multiply exponentially. You cannot social distance in a detention center. The nature of confinement makes it impossible, and the inadequate health care and limited sanitation supplies that already existed in these systems before the pandemic just helped COVID spread even more. As the pandemic hit, many across the United States, including our work, a lot of AFSC programs called for the release of as many people as possible from these carceral facilities under the umbrella of Free Them All. We were concerned for their safety. We were hearing from people who were in detention centers saying that there is no way for us to social distance, and essentially we will succumb to COVID if nothing is done. And so everyone moved to action. The Free EDC campaign, the Free Elizabeth Detention Center campaign that you run, stemmed from these actions, right? How did Free EDC differ from the anti-detention campaigns that you ran before the pandemic? And can you briefly share learnings from the ongoing advocacy that you leaned on to help you push your demand to Free EDC during the pandemic?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Peniel, for succinctly summarizing the birth of Free Them All. But and like you said, Free EDC came out of the call to free them all. And since I have joined AFSC, I have been working on Free EDC, but also recognizing that you cannot just look at one detention center here in New Jersey without recognizing that all detention centers are complicit in medical negligence and in the ways that COVID spread in New Jersey. And a large part of why so many people died and why COVID spread like wildfire in ICE detention facilities is because transfers and deportations actually did not stop. So it was just constant spreading. And just today, I had a phone call from someone inside of Elizabeth Detention Center who was telling me that cleanliness isn't they aren't cleaning, they aren't wearing masks, they aren't provided with new masks. And this is almost 2 years into a pandemic, and we know the basics that we need to stop these things. But I do think that COVID, the pandemic, and the Free EDC campaign and the way it was able to shape and be shaped by the people inside was very unique in the moment that it was established in the pandemic, and it allowed for very specific demands, whereas before our campaigns were, yes, hoping to release them all, but it wasn't the urgency as to why we need to release them that moved beyond our ideals, but also the very tangible dangers and health dangers that were taking place. COVID allowed for that demand to be very concrete. And it also highlighted, like you said, the danger of confined spaces, jails, and prisons. I do think we gained a lot of momentum and support from the community. The community was able to mobilize in a way that I think would have, where before we would have needed a lot of coordinating, a lot of meetings, a lot of ways to think around this. People were able, because of the online world and because of the time of not being confined to an office space, we were able to get people to come. And it focused on, again, the narrative. People very tangibly understood why it is that we need to free people and all people across incarceration. So it helped us because Free Them All, especially AFSC, is not just immigration detention, but it also focuses on our incarceration and our the prison industrial complex and the ways they are connected. And so it was able to amplify also the uprisings of the summer and amplify why this is a cross issue. And it also allowed for organizing to blur the lines between inside and outside, which I think is very unique and interesting, in that new technologies were introduced to replace the physical visitation and the lack of physical visitation. And as a result, we were in constant update mode with people inside who were texting us and letting me know, and others as well, what's happening inside, what the conditions were inside, and what violations were taking place. And so that allowed for creativity in how impacted community members can lead and inform discussions on the outside.
Thanks, Banan. Really interesting. I like how you ended that. Allowed for creativity for impacted community members to lead the conversations on the outside, to lead the policy strategies on the outside. And so, would you say that is an opportunity that allowed you to advance your anti-detention goals? And can you share a little bit more about what part of this work you hope that sort of developed? What part of your strategy developed during pandemic that you hope will continue? I mean, we're still in the pandemic, so people wear your mask, get vaccinated, but you hope post this crux moment would continue in your work.
Yes. So I do think the unique opportunities that did come out was we were able to mobilize different groups. We were able to come together as the diverse immigrant advocacy community was able to come together. And diversify the ways we can pressure policymakers, detention centers, and not only diversify our tactics, but also have a diverse flow of information that's happening. And as a result of that, we were able to get together. I think various immigration advocacy organizations have successfully been able to have an anti-detention bill passed in the Senate and in the House, which, if signed by the governor of New Jersey, will stop new detention centers from being established. And ICE, before this bill was out, ICE was in the process of potentially opening a new center that had 900 beds. And this will also stop current contracts from being renewed once they're up for renewal. It doesn't end detention immediately, but it really allowed for collaboration, quick flow of information, and connections in a way that were abstract and needed a lot of labor before. And I think we have been seeing a move towards shutting down, so where before we talked about shutting down detention centers as a theoretical, now it is very much a tangible goal. And hopefully, I have hope that within the next few years, there will be no immigration detention in New Jersey.
Amen to that. Thanks, Banan. I do remember in the pandemic, a lot of the efforts, the local organizing, especially spaces where folks could give testimonies in town halls and council meetings, because it was virtual, you had folks who could take a 15-minute break from work and quickly give their testimony. Whereas before the pandemic, you would have to be there in person. And so that really just expanded the access to our local elected officials that we had. So really exciting to hear how that's moving forward and in advancing our goals. So I'm going to turn to Rick and Sayrah a little here, because I feel like there's some connections between the kind of work you all do, food security, accessing food security in separate ways and for separate communities, depending on the marginalization that has occurred for them. In multiple ways, you've been addressing these economic injustices, understanding that it's more than just food. It connects to healthcare, it connects to economic access. It also then shows more so, as you look through the lens of food, it shows more so parts of the community who have also been exempted from other pieces of relief and other structures as well. So, Rick, as the need arose in this pandemic, in West Virginia, you and your colleagues worked with partners and community members to support these low-income and working families in West Virginia. And, you often say that this is a state that many have been hurting before the pandemic, right? And so the pandemic just worsened things. A key step to this was policy advocacy, which was a step further than just mutual aid of getting food to people's hands, but thinking about the bigger picture. Like you said, the pandemic was that moment. How could you harness the moment to change things more structurally and long-term? Can you share what your pandemic response looked like generally, but also while some of the changes you advocated for were temporary, what are the ones that you're hoping the West Virginia government will continue to do and make permanent for their community members?
Thanks. That's a great question. First, a lot of this stuff is cumulative and builds up over the years. So for several years, we've worked to expand free breakfast and lunch to all students in schools where there's high levels of poverty. And when you do that, it removes stigma, gives working families a break, and improves discipline and other things like that. So there's that. Then during the Trump years, we fought off mean-spirited restrictions on SNAP and programs like Medicaid. And we had a great teacher strike here in 2018 and 2019, which we loved. It was awesome. But during that highlighted the need for kids to be, child nutrition outside of school. A lot of kids here get a lot of their food from schools. And so we began working to get our legislature to pass laws that would require schools to come up with plans for out-of-school feeding. And it got shot down a couple years. And in 2020, it got shut down right as the pandemic was busting loose. And for a long time, we've been advocating summer EBT cards, kind of like SNAP benefit cards for kids. And the pandemic sort of created that sense of urgency so that PEBT cards were issued. And in the schools where we made free lunch for everybody in the counties, that means every kid got them, which means hundreds of millions of dollars to the local economy, supporting jobs. And the counties that didn't, people missed out. Just, only kids who are eligible for free or reduced lunch got the thing. So this sort of highlighted that. My coworker, Liz Brunello, helped coordinate a mutual aid thing where people could contact, and we mobilized several people short-term around the state. Like if someone just needed, hey, I need, just a little bit of food to tide me over, basics things, that did it. But some of the things that happened as a result of the pandemic, again, PEBT cards are going to be around for a while. We want to make that a permanent thing. The ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, extended free school meals through the end of 2022. We want to make that a permanent thing. I mean, school meals sounds like a real boring thing, but it's actually a really big deal. And the pandemic and the recent laws have ended the restrictions on SNAP and Medicaid work requirements and things like that. So the Biden administration has fortunately taken those things off the table. We want to make sure they stay away forever. But the big prize, seriously, this is all hands on deck, is the child tax credit, which is now refundable for families, $300 for kids 6 and under 6, $250 per child for 6 to 17, refundable so that nearly every American family gets that money. We need to make sure that low-income non-tax filers get that, and we're trying to find ways to strategize now to do that. And then get as many people to sign on as possible, because the more people we get, the harder it'll be to take it away. And finally, the fight to make it a permanent thing. And this could be like the opening step to a universal basic income, but please do not tell our beloved Senator Manchin. We don't want him to know that, but we're working on that.
I'm not on a text basis with Senator Manchin, but if I was, I would not tell him. But I think that is so exciting. So many key, like you said, similarly boring policy solutions that are life-changing for our communities as we know them. And the pandemic just allowed those, like the reluctance of our elected officials to move forward in this line, to really embrace them. And now the fight is to keep it going. If you have any resources to educate people more on how they can participate and support these efforts, please do share them, Rick, as we continue chatting. So Sayrah, to turn to you. When the pandemic occurred, New Mexico, you were doing your work, but a lot of your work was from the farmers to schools. Well, schools were not meeting in person much anymore, and during the pandemic, many things had to change. And so, why didn't you just continue or try to figure out how to adapt your ongoing projects at that time? From my research, it seemed like you launched an entirely new project, which sounds very risky in a pandemic, right? But can you share more about this and why you felt like it was urgently needed in your community?
Yeah, I really feel like it was spirit-led. I can remember the moment we came up with the Farm to Food Bank program. I was closing up the office. AFSC had wanted us to work at home in order to be safe. And I was getting ready to leave and load up my car with my laptop, and a farmer stopped by. It was a farmer who had graduated from our farm training program. He had been making a living farming for a decade with our support. And I let him know, we'll be at home now, so we'll stay in contact by phone and email. And then I said, how is the pandemic affecting you? And he said, I think I'm going to lose my farm. Like a lot of small businesses, he didn't know how he was going to withstand the pandemic. He lost every market. So the restaurants didn't want perishable food. The schools were sending everybody home. The farmers markets weren't going to open. I mean, he was just looking at a field of food he had planted and had no market and a family to provide for. And at the same time, I was hearing that the food pantries and the food banks were seeing a huge increase of people who needed them. The lines, have you seen aerial footage of like cars lined up trying to get food? And the grocery stores who gave 40% of their food to the food banks, 40% of the food bank's food comes from grocery stores that are giving like dented cans or stuff that's about to perish or expire. Because of panic buying, they weren't either. And so there were these photographs of our largest food pantry, our food bank, with completely empty warehouses, no food. So he had food and no market, and the food banks were seeing this huge increase and less donations and needed his food. And so that's when I had this aha moment of, well, we as AFSC could bridge that. We could make it a win-win. And so the idea to start a whole new project just came directly from the people who needed it. And it was just a really good fit for like, this is a way that we can keep these farms economically viable. These years of work we've done as AFSC, we have this whole network of small scale traditional farmers, family farms who are environmentally friendly, who don't exploit farm workers, who need to survive the pandemic. And then we have all these hungry people who don't have access to organic food or local food. Often the people who can afford that, because it's an unequal playing field of which farms are subsidized and which ones aren't, it means that only certain folks sometimes can get access. So it's been wonderful to see, and for the farmers too, to know that their food is going to people who need it most and maybe previously never had organic or local. And I love going to the food pantries and the food banks with really beautiful, freshly harvested carrots and garlic and potatoes and tomatoes and radishes and peaches. This week is lots of peaches right now in New Mexico. And the volunteers of the food bank are used to food that's moldy or about to expire, and their job is to sort out the bad food and what's left, what's edible. And we're bringing in like just beautiful stuff. So it's been great to see what a win-win it is for our communities and for the farmers. I had some farmers tell me last week, "You're my favorite customer," because they love that their food is going to our community and like all the people who've recently lost their jobs. And it was possible initially because of individual donors through AFSC. And then the governments found out about what you're doing. And so the CARES Act money started coming in, and county officials paid attention and said, wow, this really fits with like what we want to see in our community. So something that seemed impossible, where the food banks relied on donated food and half expired food and crumbs and not always good quality food, and the farmers couldn't sell it to the food bank. Now it's like happening. And so it's something that we think of as a proof of concept that could go beyond COVID, that this is just a good program to continue.
Great stuff. I'd like some peaches too as well, if you want to send them my way here to DC. Thank you very much. But it's really exciting to hear that, like you said, that moment where it was a people-centered solution, right? Directly from the mouth of a farmer who was really just thinking through what the concerns were for the pandemic and sharing with an already established partner. That relationship there, I think, like Rick said, this is something that was born over time. A lot of this came from relationships that were born over time. And so this moment was just where it all came together.
Yeah.
And excited to see how it moves forward a little. And so I'll circle back to you, Sayrah, because I have some questions around, county officials being excited about this and where money is coming from and going to. But I want to hear from John really quickly. So John, you spoke about the decarceration work that you've been doing in California. How did your work change during the pandemic, and what were the old and new challenges that you had to adapt to given the pandemic?
Well, like in many other places, the California prison system was hit really hard by COVID. Just like Banan was saying, you cannot socially distance inside a cage. And so there were more than 49,000 prisoners in California who contracted COVID, 232 of whom have died. And so there was a really strong push, especially near the beginning of the pandemic, to release people. At the state level, that was a very small number of releases. At the local jail, there was a much larger number. About 30% of the people in the jail were released, and then the population crept back up over the course of the last year. And I think that's it's partly representative of a backlash that we've seen, because I mentioned the uprisings of last summer. The defund police movement really just erupted onto the scene and built on things that were there, but brought a lot more people into the movement. And at a time when budgets are being considered locally and statewide, and there was a reference before to being able to participate in things online. There were city council meetings in Oakland where there were 500 people who offered public comment online and were coordinated and really pushing. So the movement itself and the base of the movement, apart from what happens in policy and budgets, has grown. And I think some of that growth is sustained and sustainable. The pandemic also has had just like the rest of us are tired of Zoom. All respect for this medium that we're on right at this moment, but the activists are tired. But for people inside prison, the impact is even greater, because while they may be able to speak with their family members or lawyers but digitally, the lack of physical contact has had huge impacts on mental health inside these facilities. And so that's something that we're looking at very seriously, of the one more reason why releases are really important. The one other thing I would say is that the COVID money that started to come in, that Sayrah also talked about, has been an opportunity to begin to fund the things that we want for community safety instead of policing. And we can talk about that more in a minute, but I think that's been a big focus of our work is, okay, the police are not providing us safety, and there is now resources. You say you don't have resources, or a lot of jurisdictions, they don't want to lay off police, and some of them have legal issues with laying off police until they have some other kind of community safety system in place. But the federal and state funding that's coming in does provide an opportunity to build up community-based safety programs, whether those are government or non-governmental or from the community.
Thanks, John, for sharing that. And really important about the funding, the availability of the funding. And I think definitely another conversation we need to have is that what are the new challenges because of the pandemic that we need to address in our ongoing organizing? Not having access to physical contact with family members has brought up this new issue of mental health and more within carceral facilities that we have to address, while at the same time trying to get people released. So nothing too complicated, just trying to protect our community members as usual. But I wanted to hear from Sayrah a little bit. You spoke about the county officials, and this ties into John's comment on the money, right? County officials expressed some interest. CARES dollars came in. There might be some more money coming in. How is this extra money from the federal government, or the interest from the federal government? How has it poised your program now to sort of give it more longevity and more resilience to, I guess, council whims of not wanting to fund or wanting to fund things?
Yeah. So when we first started Farm to Food Bank, the way I had money was that we sadly had to cancel our Cesar Chavez celebration. But I thought it was such a wonderful way to honor Cesar Chavez, one of the leaders of the farm worker movement, by purchasing food from local farmers and giving it to the people who need it. So that's how it started. But of course, that wouldn't be enough, to keep it going. And so I was really happy that the county, Albuquerque's and Bernalillo County, knew who AFSC was, said, we trust AFSC, we heard about your program. And one of the goals in our county is to continue agriculture. So we're losing farmers. Farmers are aging out. And so they've been modeling a training program based on our farmer training program. And so for them, it was like, well, we're trying to bring back farms. And now the pandemic is shutting down farms. So this is a great way for us to use our CARES Act money, is to have it go to the food bank, to the farmers. And so they gave us part of the CARES Act funding, which really meant that I could keep Farm to Food Bank, because back in March of 2020, we didn't know how long the pandemic would go. And I mean, it's sad to say we're in July of 2021 and it's still happening. So that was great. And then when that ran out, the county was so happy with what we were doing that they said, well, we're going to fund it straight out of our county budget. It's no longer just federal CARES Act COVID money. This is now county money, because this is such a great program. And we're also part of the Health Equity Council that looks at issues around equity and food access and healthy food for communities and economic justice. And they really like it. And so we're putting together recommendations from all the different sectors in the city and county to present to the mayor and the city council about what did we do during COVID? How did we adapt things that shouldn't just be during COVID? They should just continue to exist, that people who rely on food pantries and food banks get quality food. And we had farmers tell us if it weren't for Farm to Food Bank, they would have had to lay off their workers. And so they were able to keep workers at living wages. We only work with farms that don't exploit farm workers. And so just all these wonderful testimonies we were getting from farmers about how important this was and how happy they are that their food is going to food banks. And then the food banks are saying, we've never gotten such good quality food. So it's just exciting to see that the county went beyond CARES Act and now sees this as we can take money from our budget for this. And we have, we're going to be having a conversation with the city. We also were contacted by FEMA to ask us how we were doing it. We had other cities in New Mexico start replicating what we were doing in northern New Mexico. And now we're talking to other states about different people in other states had similar ideas to ours. And so we're talking across the country about what's happening. And now we're part of a global group that includes Canada and the UK talking about what's happening. So I think there's just a lot of interest in the structurally it's very flawed. Our way of feeding people, our food system, and our food pantry and food bank system, and our farming system. There's all of these flaws that we've known, and we've wanted systemic change. But now we have proof of concept. Now we can show that there is a better way, and we've done it, and we have data. And so I'm hoping that it will be beyond COVID, and we can show this.
Thanks, Sayrah, for sharing that. I know we are running out of time. I just want to let our listeners know, if you have any questions for our speakers, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them. So something, Sayrah, that we're understanding is that the investment of the money from the CARES Act and from the federal dollars really allowed the program to stand on its two legs and show that it's worth the investment from the county level. And so that was really great to hear. So I want to turn back to Banan a little bit. The money that came in from the pandemic and the momentum from the pandemic, we're slowly running out of that steam. You know, John had said the facilities are filling back up, right? Detention centers are filling back up. So what are some things that you have to be wary of as you move forward from capitalizing on this freedom all moment during the pandemic, and as you continue to amplify your calls to close detention centers in New Jersey and across the US?
Yeah, thank you. I think, and thank you, John, for sharing all of that, because it's very much similar here in New Jersey, and I can say very confidently, probably across the U.S. in that because there is this idea that the pandemic may be on its way out, and we know that it is not. People might not feel the same sense of urgency, but like he was saying, these centers are filling up. Conditions are not any better, and so a few things to be wary of, I would say, is that to not forget the urgency of all of this, but also in terms of also not to sit to sit in the victories as well, and to celebrate the victories of the anti-detention bill and all of the work that has gotten to where we are at, but also recognize that sometimes and oftentimes these things can lead to some sort of manipulation. As in here in New Jersey, what's happening is, as a result of potential shutdowns, instead of releasing people, ICE is transferring them very far away from their families. And the narrative that's coming out is, this is what you wanted. Didn't you want to shut down the detention centers? And it is because of your work that we're doing these transfers, when in actuality, it is ICE's decision to not release people. And so we have to be wary to not to give into their speaking points, because there has been now this tension within our community, whether or not this was the right move. And it is the right move. Any move to shut down detention centers will always be the right move. It's also important to never forget the connection between detention centers and the prison industrial complex. It goes very much hand in hand. Many of the people who are in detention come straight from prisons and state prisons and local prisons. So, and never forget to connect what's happening in our local settings to the federal. It is also, ICE is a federal agency, and it is on us to pressure our federal and the people that we voted into office, and with the promise that things will change, and things have not changed. If not, I can say that it's getting worse, but it's with a nicer smile. And so there are a few things to be wary of, and not to capitalize on ICE's manipulation, to focus on the original call to free them all, regardless of whether or not there's a pandemic, and to also always constantly recognize that the pandemic is not over.
Thanks, Banan. Super helpful to hear that, and that nuance of like, what happens when you get your policy goal? What does the implementation look like, and does that worsen situations or help situations? I want to hear briefly from Rick about it. You know, in November after the elections, Rick, you wrote a really timely blog on how people make policy change happen, and you referenced that at the top of this this conversation, illustrating from this popular model on exploring a window for affecting change that opens when three streams come together. So the policy, the problem, and the political stream. And all of us have been part of groups that have, you know, floated certain policy solutions based on the problems that we've gleaned from our community members. And once that issue is in the public, the issue is a problem, like we identify it as a problem, and we link it to the policy solution, we then wait for the perfect moment to take action. And what we see is that the pandemic maybe was that perfect moment, and you've described it a lot more here. Using West Virginia as a case study, how would you say these streams came together effectively to effect change for your community? And what do you hope when the moment is over, right? What are the custom benefits for you all of the capitalization of that moment moving forward?
I'll just use a real simple example of that. As I mentioned ever since the teacher strike, we pushed for the legislature to create a plan. And, when they refused to do it on the last day and the pandemic hit, it was like, maybe our theory was correct. And so between that and the mutual aid thing, people saw this as a problem to be fixed and not a condition to be endured. So that was one thing that changed it. And then, we bugged people, and there was enough concern and noise and organizing politically that to move the legislature recently to create a hunger working group, which was a big step forward. But it's just I think, though, that model of the three streams is just kind of the way the world works. It works for good or bad. Like 9/11 changed everything and made certain things impossible. And I think to get better at this, we just need to pay attention constantly to what's happening, what the openings are, and be ready to hit it whenever that happens.
Thanks, Rick, for sharing. What you said at the end, where like for better or for worse, these streams come together. And we know that not just the pandemic last year, but the summer uprisings, we know for a fact that a lot of times our community members and the harm that comes to our community members, Black and Brown individuals in particular, are the political streams where change oftentimes comes. We also know what it is like to see the hurts of our community used as a reformist reform rather than concrete change in a harmful reactionary mode. So, John, wanted to hear from you about you've spoken about the dollars that are coming from at the federal level to implement some investment in alternatives to policing and sort of moving our community safety beyond policing. We also know some of those dollars are influenced by the killing of George Floyd and the uprising that followed that. What are the custom benefits for your work, especially because it's talking about money, and we often operate in a scarcity mentality as a community? What are the custom benefits of leaning into this moment of policy where money is coming and you can use it to change goals in your community, but it might not be sustained?
Well, I think it's really important to look at the recent history flow, right? So in the first round of CARES money, a significant amount of money actually went to gun companies and gun dealers as essential businesses. Then we had a run on guns, on gun purchases all of last year and up until this point, unprecedented numbers of gun purchases. Now, for our surprise, there is a rise in the number of gun homicides and other types of gun violence. And the response to that from the federal government and by some state and local governments is, we have more violence, we need more police. So that becomes part of the narrative of backlash. And I think activists at the local level, the new American Rescue Plan money that's coming down, there's a lot of flexibility for local and state governments, and some of it is going through state governments on how it's used. A lot of it is not decided in the formal process of the annual state budget, because the feds have not yet said how you can use it. You haven't created the criteria and the templates and everything. So local governments are going to be deciding in the next few months, which means that activists need to be organized and alert to how local governments are deciding on how that money is used. That it not go to additional policing, but it go to the community safety and mental health and housing and the kind of agricultural programs and food programs that both Sayrah and Rick were talking about, instead of more investment in the fear-based programs that are really part of that backlash.
Thanks, Rick. And to close us out, just wanted to ask Sayrah as well. In your community, given the two political streams that we identified, the Black Lives Matter defund the police movement and the pandemic as it was, did you see that materialize to true policy change for you all in your community, aside from just, the food systems work that you're doing?
Yes, I did. I'm so grateful to the Movement for Black Lives because I think there is a shift. And there's been a fight against police violence in Albuquerque for decades. We have the Department of Justice here, and our DOJ monitor has said that the police refuse to follow reforms. They're just writing scathing reports about our police department. And it just feels like people weren't believing, and the Movement for Black Lives really changed the conversation. And sadly, the videotaping of George Floyd's murder, it got people starting, I think, to believe, those of us who have been speaking out. Albuquerque Police Department killed someone I knew. And so I'm in this sad group of people who've had a loved one killed by the police. And one of the ways we've seen change this year is that our city councils agreed to create a community safety department that will not have any police, and will be people who are trained with mental health issues, substance abuse, homelessness, all of these issues where we don't need police in those. And so that's exciting to see a community safety department and figuring out the funding for that. And we've been requesting the funding come out of the police budget, which is one of the largest parts of the Albuquerque city budget is paying for police, but it really should be shifted to community safety. So that's an opening that's happening. And so by fall, I think we're going to have a community safety department.
That's great. Thank you so much. I just want to say a huge thank you to you all, Banan, Rick, Sayrah, and John, for sharing. I know we went over our time, but there was so much to learn from you all and hear about the work that's going on. I think definitely what we're hearing is that we need to mold long-term solutions that not just address immediate crisis, but pave a way for just recovery. You know, we're hearing build back better, recovery, but we're hearing economic terms, infrastructure. The people are also infrastructure, the society as well, and our communities that whose back really the community, the economy lies on, are also part of this infrastructure that we should be investing in multiple ways. And so we want to make sure that we're prioritizing our community members, leaving no one behind, and also remembering that as COVID has passed, it brought its own problems as well that will be added onto the solution, that will be added onto our work, that we need to find solutions for. So we're in this for the long haul. So just want to pause really briefly to see if we have any questions from the chat, from our listeners in the comment section, before we close us out. So just give it like a minute or two before we close out for the day. So if you have any questions for any of our speakers, please just put it in the chat now, or we can go ahead on with our busy days. All right, I've given it a couple seconds. I see no questions. So I just want to say a huge thank you to you all for spending your time with us this afternoon. Thanks to our panelists for the commitment to this work, for sharing your work as well, for all the work that you're doing. Super grateful. And yeah, same time, same place next week. We'll have another Facebook Live mini with some other great colleagues of ours who'll be talking about our social justice work and how you can get involved as well. Do have a good rest of your day, y'all. Bye.
Thank you.